Today we're going to discuss Renaissance art. We're going to compare it with the staid art of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages art that was flat, two-dimensional, almost exclusively focused on religious concepts. Renaissance art's going to be different, but how is it going to be different? The man of the Renaissance, particularly the man of the Italian Renaissance, measured his worth by how much money he could spend on the arts. Patrons like Lorenzo the Magnificent or Cosimo de' Medici or even the Pope would spend vast amounts of money as patrons of men like Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Donatello, Botticelli, Brunelleschi. All of these men were able to do their art because patrons were there. And why were they able to do that? It was because Italy's location on the boot there, sticking out of the Mediterranean, gave it control over the trade throughout the Mediterranean. And this is where banking is going to start. And those interest rates in banking are going to provide the funds that allow these patrons to continue. Art was there to communicate not just social value, but also personal value. These men need to be seen as something great. And if you can't make the art, maybe you can pay for it. Let's talk for a minute about characteristics of art. In the Renaissance, the very first characteristic of art is realism and expression. We're not just making art because it's beautiful anymore. We're trying to make art leap off the page. We're trying to make art that looks real. The Renaissance artist was trying to speak truth through their art, whether that be a sculpture or a wall painting or a mosaic or a fresco. It didn't matter. You needed to be honest with everything. I think the first great example that I'm going to show you is from Masaccio in 1427, and it's called Expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And it's Masaccio telling the story of Adam and Eve being pushed out of the Garden of Eden. It's also the first nude since the classical times, since the Roman period. The people were a lot less picky about that stuff during the Renaissance. The male form and the female form were considered to be something beautiful, to be celebrated, not dirty and hidden. The second major characteristic of Renaissance art is the use of perspective. You remember back when we looked at the Middle Ages art, everything was two-dimensional. It was kind of flat. Nothing leaped off the page. Well, during the Renaissance period, they're going to learn about perspective. And they're going to learn about putting a focal point there in the middle of the page and drawing linear perspective lines in and showing things with depth, to where when you looked at this art, it felt like you were there. It wasn't a flat piece of art. It was like a photograph. It was like the reporters of the day. Again, I think the best example of this is Masaccio with his example with the Trinity in 1427. For our third characteristic of Renaissance art, we're going to talk about classicism. And we discussed this in the previous lecture. But in the ruins of the ancient Roman Empire, on the Italian city-states in Florence, Venice, Rome, they discovered this old Roman art. And the Renaissance artists believed it was truer, it was more honest than the Middle Ages art. So they sought to, I won't say copy it, but complement it. And suddenly art became three-dimensional, even in sculptures. And instead of having something that is meant to be looked at from the front, our sculptures were meant to be walked around and seen all the details of them. Whether it be Donatello's David or Michelangelo's Pieta, it was all a throwback to the ideas of Roman classicism. It was also a time period when the art was very humanistic and dealt with oftentimes mythological and secular ideas besides just religious ideas. While the Middle Ages was dealing with almost exclusively religious ideas, these guys want to touch on the everyday. They want to make the life of the average person real to us. The fourth characteristic I want to talk about is balance. Symmetry in a painting. If something happens on the left, something has to happen on the right. If something is happening at the top, something has to happen at the bottom. Now, I'm not saying that they're mirror images of each other, but the art was very balanced. Again, whether it be a sculpture or a fresco on a wall, there's a balance to it that draws the eye inward. Our fifth characteristic today is a focus on individualism. What does that mean? That means that they're trying to draw things that look uniquely different from everything else. You remember in the Middle Ages art, you would see these paintings of the saints. And the saint would stand out to you, but all the people in the background kind of had a generic look to them. They were kind of the same all the way through. You're not going to see that in the Renaissance. They're going to go into great detail to make sure that All of the people throughout the painting are a little bit different. And if they're doing a portrait of you, which was very big in this time period, that portrait is going to be individualized. It's going to be honest. It's going to be what I like to call warts and all. If you've got a great big wart on your nose, they're going to paint that wart on your nose because that's honest. And a Renaissance artist would say honesty is inherently beautiful. Our sixth characteristic of Renaissance art is this idea of using geometry in your art. Remember, a Renaissance man was a man that was a master of everything. They were artists and sculptors and poets and mathematicians. And we find the use of angles and triangles all the way through the Renaissance period. Today we know that this is something that's almost comforting to mankind. We see these shapes in art, and it gives us a sense of order, something the Renaissance artists seem to inherently understand. Renaissance artists were also masters of light and shadow. That's going to be our seventh characteristic. If you look at a painting from Leonardo da Vinci, you will notice shadows and lights leaping at you off the page. There's always one spot where the light is focused from, and it gives everything a great bit of depth to it. Again, it's a separation from the flatness of the Middle Ages. Renaissance architecture was also quite a bit different than anything that we saw in the Middle Ages. We're not talking about Gothic or Romanesque. We're talking about classical architecture. Probably the greatest example of this is Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi built this beautiful dome in Florence, and I'll show you a picture of it. To get this, he went to Italy, and he spent a great deal of time studying the Pantheon in Rome. Remember, the Pantheon was that ancient church with the large dome and the oculus at the top of it. He studied that and came up with his own way of doing this. His secret was interlocking the bricks in such a geometric pattern that the weight was shifted downward, and you were able to build this dome without anything supporting it, or at least anything obvious supporting it. It's a strategy that's been repeated over and over again. And I'll post some pictures so you can see how Brunelleschi's dome has influenced everything from St. Peter's Cathedral to the U.S. Capitol.